On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Nikhil Goyal. He is the Director of Data and Analytics at LeafLink. Going to tackle a few different subjects over the course of the next 30 minutes with you. We're going to talk about how within the cannabis industries, there's specific challenges when it comes to data, different stages of maturity that he's tackling, the roadmap that he needs to set up to effectively accommodate short-term and long-term needs of the company. He's got decisions between buy versus build, which everyone else is facing. We'll kind of get his insights and his thoughts on how he's approaching that. And a couple of things that we're going to definitely dive into. Nikhil, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for doing this. And obviously, I did not do your background justice. You have a fantastic background, and maybe would be great to let the audience know who you are, what LeafLink does, and kind of how you got to the point you have.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I'm Nikhil Goyal, Director of Data and Analytics at LeafLink, right now covering three functions really, or three sort of sub-functions under the data and analytics umbrella: data engineering, business intelligence, and data science. Prior to LeafLink, I was running the data science operations for Gartner's marketing practice. And before that, I was in customer analytics at Macy's, where I was working on building a churn model, doing basket analysis, helping our merchants across various divisions make optimized decisions on buying and marketing. And prior to that, I have had gigs as consultant at Ernst & Young. I've been at, for a short while, at an agency, which is a WPP agency, and I spent a little bit of time at Viacom as well in the advanced analytics team there. Coming to LeafLink, well, LeafLink is the cannabis industry's wholesale marketplace. We operate in 26 markets across the US. We do $3 billion in cannabis sales on an annualized basis. 32% of all cannabis trade in America happens through LeafLink, the platform. 4 out of every 5 retailers in America are on LeafLink. We have 400,000. I didn't know that there are 400,000 active cannabis products before I actually came to LeafLink. Yeah, and basically we are trying to define the way the industry does cannabis transactions.
Awesome. So absolutely brand new industry to you. I mean, I guess it's a young industry. It's kind of growing. I guess, a little bit different to what you've done in the past. I guess, what were your thoughts? Obviously, you've been there now a little bit less than a year, but when you first started, what were you going to tackle first? And also, what was there? Like, what were you inheriting? How much of the data and analytics was built out? What were you dealing with?
Well, very typical situation like a Series A or Series B startup, I would say. Basically, initially you need only engineers and you need nothing but engineers to build your product. And then you get the engineers in and they build apps, and the apps start collecting a lot of data. And now you are done with your sort of the low-hanging fruit of building the product, getting something out into the market. And suddenly you need to make better decisions with all of this data that you're collecting. And then departments spin up and everyone starts asking questions. And, typically what happens is the DevOps team or the engineering team tells you, well, here's a production database. Don't run anything on it. And we will give you a read replica. Run your SQL on it. And that's exactly what happened with us. And what I inherited was queries being run using Periscope on top of a read replica of our database, and a set of cron jobs, which were doing some basic transformations and creating tables. But at the same time, our business growing at like 30, 40, 50% month on month. And the company going from like 40 people to 130 people in the space of 6 months. So all of a sudden, demand for data was a lot higher than our ability to cope with to keep up with, really. So that's kind of the situation that I walked into. And there was myself and a senior BI analyst and another BI analyst who had been there for about 2 weeks. And we were getting a lot of questions, basically.
So I guess, senior manager of analytics at several, Viacom, Macy's, Gartner, larger organizations. Were you still like IC in some of those capacities, or were you pretty hands off at that point?
I've always been hands on, and I prefer to stay hands on, basically for a few different reasons. One is like I'm in the trade because I like analyzing data. if you're not in it to find out what you're going to find by doing the analysis, then I really don't see why anyone would be in the data field. Secondly, I don't think I can effectively mentor and guide people unless I am abreast and I, stay hands on with some of the things that I do. So, what has changed over time is the proportion of time that I can actually spend as, team grows or what my role in the company is changes. I think over time, when I started as a senior analyst at Geometry Global, I was completely hands on, including like doing testing of analytics tagging plans on Omniture on the website of our clients, building, digital analytics reports and things like that. On my first day of Geometry, basically, I was given like a 400,000 row data set, which was a media dump with like sales data, and basically asked to produce a model to determine how to invest TV monies for a $100 million TV ad spending client. So super hands-on basically at that point. Going into Viacom and Macy's, very similar situation. I had managerial responsibilities at both the places. But again, it was very much like, I had to spend only maybe say 20-30% of my time in terms of managing and 70% of my time in defining the project and actually executing upon it as well. So a lot of very deep introduction into what Nielsen ratings look like, coming from like 4,000 different channels across the US and coming for a panel of like 120,000 people. So my first taste of really wide data sets and not long data sets with TV. And then at Macy's, again, basically I was very hands-on in the sense that I proposed a project to predict churn at Macy's because at that point we were bleeding customers a lot. And I think Macy's still is. And then the goal there was like, we were always reacting to churn. Like, it happened and now what do you do about it? Well, that person is already shopped on Amazon. What can you do about it? So Macy's, believe it or not, has an extremely rich database. Basically 70 to 80% of all American consumers are represented in the Macy's database. And if you've ever swiped your credit card at any Macy's or online, they know who you are because they have extremely strong hooks with multiple, credit card trackers like Experian and things like that. So, or Axiom. So we had like really great data. But then my point was that I know for the last 7 years what this customer has been doing at Macy's. I know exactly what time of the year they shop usually, when their spending goes up, where they spend money. I know that this customer buys foundation every 120 days. So I can start predicting when they are about to churn, or I can even start just calculating when they have gone past their cycle. So why don't we get a little smart about it? So had to implement that churn model. So again, like a very, very hands-on project. And I would say I really started appreciating feature engineering at Macy's when I did that whole exercise, because I was basically dealing with hundreds of tables, many different columns. But what I needed ultimately was 20 to 25 really intelligent features that can define what the churn like looks like or what will end up looking like. From there, again, moving into Gartner, that's where I think there was a significant shift in my hands-on time. I moved from being like 70% hands-on to like initially 50%. Then once I got people situated on my team, because the team grew when I started there, leading the team at 3 people. And when I left, the team was 11 data scientists slash data engineers. And this was about 3.5 years. So as we built the team up and we built processes, then we are able to offboard processes to individuals within the team. And then slowly over time, my hands-on time actually shrunk. And then I had to get much more involved with basically making sure that data has a seat on the table when strategy is being decided, when product is being decided, when people are making inferences and how they're representing that data in front of clients. I had to be a lot more on top of it, a part of those conversations, and also sort of like in many cases, like put my foot down from a data perspective and say that no business user, you can't do that, and things like that. So that's where it shrunk. And now my strategy is something that I borrowed from my previous manager, John Gibbs. He's at Spotify now. But basically, he explained it to me this way, that you will always want to do analysis. It will never end. You will always want to get hands dirty with regexes, with like, understanding and solving problems with pipelining and things like that. So do this. Every quarter, pick one project and say, I'm going to work on that one project this quarter. And don't let it be something that is urgent and something that is going to make the rest of the team and organization dependent on you. But let it be something strategic and chip away at that project in the background. So that way you keep yourself, mentally occupied and sort of, you don't let your analytics muscle atrophy. And at the same time, you can dedicate enough time towards making people effective, because that's where really the value is. If I can spend 80% of my time making other analytics engineers and data scientists on my team way more effective, I think that's like time better spent at this point for me.
Sure, that makes sense. And I guess it sounds like obviously you've been progressing your career at different components. So you obviously have been in environments with a lot of data and a lot of metadata associated with that data, so that you could absolutely dig in different angles. So obviously, it seems like LeafLink in cannabis, it's a new industry. Yeah, it's burgeoning. Regulations are changing. It's very fluid. How do you adjust it to being in an environment where it seems like it's pretty radically different than what you were maybe working at the last couple of roles?
Yeah, certainly. So the biggest difference is that this is B2B, and I've always been focused on B2C data and analytics. So I think that's a huge difference. The other difference is that there is a certain inherited knowledge that exists in the B2C industry in terms of what is the data we need to capture even. So it's a no-brainer now that we know that we need to capture certain attributes. When you look at a receipt from a POS system, everything on it is valuable information that needs to be saved into a database. And then we put metadata on top of it. We look at the product description and we parse things out. And there's some pretty sophisticated techniques and modeling built to do all this. And it's kind of become the job of other third parties, ancillary companies that do all this for us. And we get like really clean, nice data. With cannabis, it's totally a different situation. So there are many similarities as well in that we operate very much like an e-commerce marketplace. We have 5 different businesses, but marketplace and e-commerce is definitely the biggest component of it. And so the similarity is that, well, you can still do churn prediction, you can still do basket analysis, you can still do optimization of your pages and what you show and personalization. So all of those B2C concepts translate over into the e-commerce world. The problem is that the data is not there yet, because none of those practices that are inherited in the B2C world from a data capture standpoint exist in the cannabis world. So basically most of the sources are typically like POS systems, right? When it comes to capturing data, there are many, many POS systems basically in cannabis space, and everyone's trying to start up and bringing in their own standards for doing that and capturing. Some markets are not even represented. A lot of cannabis trade is cash based. So where do you get data for that? That's not even captured. Then there is a coverage problem. So basically, because we don't have same level of maturity, a Michigan and an Oklahoma and a California, what you get from each of those markets can be really, really different. And then standardization. So basically, when it comes to CPG, there's a pretty well understood taxonomy and hierarchy of categorization, right? Like you start with consumer goods, you break consumer goods down into then further saying CPG, and CPG, then you say, okay, this is personal care or baby care, and then you break things down into that for the product lines. In cannabis, that doesn't exist today. It kind of does, but everyone sort of like has their own top level classifications. Everyone has their own sub classifications under that and things like that. So, well, which one is relevant? Now, if I am trying to provide information to a buyer or a seller, I need to frame it in a way that they understand it, and if they don't, then it's not really useful. So we have a lot of taxonomy and standardization related issues. And part of the problem is that there is no federal regulation, or from like an FDA perspective, like, hey, here's the exact code for this particular product in the FDA guidelines. And here is the UPC that has been registered under, and therefore we know how to roll this up always. That doesn't exist in the cannabis space today. That being said, I will add that in this situation, we are in a very good place because we have 400,000 products. So I would say that we have a unique opportunity to actually go and define what that needs to look like in the industry. And lastly, just like the infrastructure, right? Like the infrastructure does not exist today to standardize and move this information from place to place. For example, you have like Nielsen scanners or IRI scanners capturing all of this information and able to give you very accurate positions of like where does Huggies stand versus Pampers in the Chicago market, because it's so nailed down. Like you have UPCs, you have scanners, you have Nielsen doing all of their paneling, and now that market share number is very, very crystal clear because you have the infrastructure to report that number. That doesn't exist in cannabis yet. So that's kind of the other challenge.
I guess it's interesting because I mean, it sounds like there's some positive factors in play for you, and then there's obviously some, just the industry's emerging. You've come in there, obviously, you're trying to set up the short-term, long-term needs and trying to, understand what the company needs to stay competitive. Are there specific tools, from an analytics perspective, even on the market, or like, would you have to buy generic products and customize them, or is it a case where you just really have to just build what you need to manage for the data and analytics side?
Yeah, so when it comes to tools, I guess, like a lot of the things that I was referring to as like infrastructure and capture technology and things like that, that's not LeafLink's core business. We think of it from a partnership angle, that who are partners in the market that LeafLink can create integrations with, that LeafLink can create like partnerships with to sort of like standardize, define what things need to look like. And because we are the biggest marketplace, a lot of times we're able to rally a few different players around to one standard for how the integration needs to be defined. So I think that's kind of our role when it comes to building, choosing tools, tech, etc. It's not so much choice, but it's rather about like being the not the forcing factor, but sort of the consolidator of knowledge or being able to provide that expertise. But when I think about tools that we need for the data stack itself, that's very much similar to what you would see in any typical data stack. We need something to do our BI. I think that what we need over time like changes for doing BI. Like we start with everything is a canned report or ad hoc report to like now you can actually not just get canned report, but also you can self-serve a large part of the analytics. Then we need orchestration technology. So we need something to pipeline our data and move it. And I think that's become a really crowded space now. Depending on which part of the data value chain you are operating on, like whether you are talking about source data capture to then actually transforming that data, or then to even like, let's say, creating a completely self-serve paradigm of data, you have a whole bunch of technologies and tools that have sprouted. And I think that's where we had to like spend some time on thinking what we actually want. And the third part of it is the warehouse, obviously. So, typically there is like an OLTP style database. In our case, it's an AWS, RDS, Postgres databases. That's what our engineering team likes. But then there's a whole bunch of data warehousing technologies now. There was Redshift, and even before then, there was like the likes of Vertica and CouchDB and things like that. But then Redshift came about. Then from there, Snowflake became like a big thing, still growing astronomically. And now, most recently, I've heard of Firebolt. So basically, a whole host of technologies again, in terms of like what do we choose. So that was actually one of the most early decisions I had to make, which my manager and CTO entrusted me with, is like, what is the right set of tech choices for your team for orchestration, for BI, and for data warehousing? And how are you going to go about picking that?
What does the infrastructure now look like now that you've settled in? What's all the pieces?
So basically, the long-term goal there is to orchestrate away as much of the data ops or DevOps possible as managed services. The short-term goal is like, well, what can I get started with really quickly and driving value, right? So a lot of our, not a lot, but some of our choices were driven by that. So when it comes to just loading data, we have a couple of options. We use Fivetran and we use Segment. Fivetran is really cool if you just want to like, especially do log replication of production data into your warehouse. Easiest off-the-shelf solution. We found them like pretty good compared to a bunch of other vendors that we tried out. And then we use Segment for our event data. So we have a live stream like an e-commerce website of user actions going on. And we use JavaScript trackers from Segment all across our website to pipe that directly into our warehouse. And then when it comes to the warehouse itself, people would question this, but we went with Redshift, a traditional Redshift cluster, instead of going with like Snowflake, which is fully managed as a service. And really, the driving force there was our ability to terraformize and write infrastructure as code, which our DevOps already had templates for. And we were extremely comfortable provisioning and managing Redshift clusters. So again, going back to the idea of like, what can I get started with really quick and drive value? Our data is not huge. Our data is powerful. It's small. It's first party e-commerce data, so it's powerful, but it's not huge because it's B2B. So Redshift suffices just fine for our needs now. Maybe we want to move to a completely managed data warehouse in the future. And then in terms of the orchestration and pipelining, we started with a single node Airflow cluster with a Celery executor. And that quickly we outgrew it, basically. We realized that, okay, this is not going to be able to handle our load. We worked with our DevOps on provisioning Airflow on Kubernetes. After that, initially I had concerns about the steep learning curve and how much overhead or cost it's going to impose on data team members in terms of using Airflow on Kubernetes. It's that typical situation where as an analyst or even as an analytics engineer, all I want is the answer to the question. Like I want the perfect answer that I can go and present to the stakeholder and inform their decisions. As an engineer, I care a lot about the house that I'm building. It's basically like a beautiful museum that anyone can walk into. That's how engineers think. And then with analytics engineers and data engineers, it's sort of like always an intersection of both. Like I need to keep one foot on both boards. Like, hey, I need to find the perfect answer, but now I also need to use a perfectly scalable technology kind of situation. But working with our DevOps was really helpful because they actually, the way I frame it is like, well, I'm going to tell you my problems and you solve it for me. As long as you address my problems, I'll go with whatever technology you want me to use. And so we ended up using Airflow on Kubernetes with a staging environment, with a prod environment, with a local environment. The local environment helps us to develop everything without having to go through deployment. But once we are confident and we have merged into master, we can then move things into the deployment phase. And we have a really cool bot, which our DevOps has put together for the company. It's called Lloyd. And basically you say, hey, Lloyd, deploy, commit, tag, so and so for me. And then Lloyd goes in and deploys things to staging. And then you say, hey, Lloyd, now deploy this to production. And then Lloyd goes in and deploys our pipelines to production. So we are able to version our pipelines really well. We are able to manage a commit history, a patch version of things. We're able to revert state if things go wrong and look off. That's kind of been the advantage of working really closely with DevOps and being open-minded and listening to their recommendations.
So it must have been obviously you're much closer, smaller teams than maybe previous jobs where some of the collaboration with DevOps, if an idea is coming up, it's maybe just test it out. There's less change management, maybe less controls in place, gives you a little bit more flexibility.
So I think that's a function of how organization situates the data team in the org structure. And typically I've seen that when you treat DevOps as IT, or if you treat analytics as its own thing without any linkage with the engineering side, then the collaboration does not happen. Basically, that's kind of again the situation with data teams. We need to be equally connected to our engineering team and equally connected to our business side. So the question then becomes like, well, where should the data team then sit? And most organizations, what they've done in the past, at least I've seen, is they went and made their own shiny pearls or objects called the data center of excellence. What does the data center of excellence do? Well, it doesn't talk very well to the business. So the business doesn't know what they do. And it doesn't talk really well to the engineers. So the engineers are frustrated also about whatever the data team is trying to do, which is breaking their databases. And I think we found a really good sweet spot there with LeafLink. The data team sits under the product engineering organization. I report into the CTO. The CTO is a co-founder, so he's very much grounded in the org strategy and has a very good understanding of what actually makes the highest business impact from a data and from a tech standpoint. So I think that allows us to be really close to our DevOps. But at the same time, because data is independent under the product and engineering organization, we are able to talk to the business and represent our views. And infrastructure choices, orchestration choices are able to account for the business side needs as well when it comes to analytics. To give you an example of like what that means is initially our DevOps really wanted us to use Airflow for deployment to both staging and production, but did not so much provision for like a local development sort of like environment. So every time I needed to change anything on a SQL query, will I have to like push data into staging to see what actually happened? As like this, I mean, from a data team's perspective, that totally destroys your agility. So then we had to make sure that we represented to them that no, we need a local environment. We need to be able to send data into staging and see what it looks like without having to run through the whole deployment cycle. Once we are confident that that's accurate, we are able to go from there. Similarly, with the choice of BI, a lot of people would go for a lot more canned reporting where users don't have control. But we have a very diverse set of users, and our BI needs, like to me, it's really important that you have data as a product, which means we will give you a set of canned reports, but it's also important to have data as a service and let users do their own analytics as well. Explore, as long as we guarantee the source quality of the data and we manage the calculation and definition of like key metrics, like you should be able to play with it. So therefore we chose Tableau because Tableau gives you that really easy drag and drop interface. It allows you to extract data sources from your warehouse where you can like define sort of a semantic layer. So it's not an explicitly defined semantic layer. We capture that as part of our definition in the DAGs itself. But some of those choices, basically, we were able to make keeping in mind what works for both the engineering side and works for the business side. An interesting piece of technology there is DBT, which we are now, I'm familiar with DBT, used it at Gartner extensively. And now I would like to introduce that as well because the semantic layer and logic and consistency between data models, DBT is built for that stuff. It's any SQL analyst's best friend, DBT. And that's something that we are trying to implement as well. The only problem is that it needs to be its own repository separate from Airflow. So we are figuring out the technical aspects of it now.
What's coming on, like in terms of now that you've gotten a lot of the foundation set, you've been there 9 months, you've doing the plumbing. What's the next big initiative that you feel like you've got to get out for the company? What's like the next big project that you anticipate providing some uplift to the data team?
Like I said, we have 5 businesses operating within LeafLink. We have LeafLink Financial, which recently received a $250 million secured credit facility. It's the biggest ever injection of liquidity into the cannabis space. And that business is growing at a rather rapid pace, and we need to like support their needs. And then we have the LeafLink marketplace itself, and then we have LeafLink Logistics, which takes care of the last mile delivery, and that again is growing at a rapid pace. So the next step is really, a few important projects that are going on. One is a formal exercise to create segmentation of LeafLink's customer base. And I see that very much as an exercise that needs to be driven by the analytics and business operations and the marketing team. So I've partnered with my head of marketing and head of business operations to create a value and a behavioral segmentation for all of the LeafLink sellers and buyers, which can help inform what is the next best action or what are our goals even with every individual segment and how many segments do we need and how do we make this part of the formal language when it comes to sales engagement, when it comes to marketing engagement, when it comes to product features. So that's a really big initiative. And you would think that the plumbing sounds so different from the segmentation. It's not. When you think about churn reporting, when you think about segmentation of buyers and sellers, or when you talk about like company level KPIs and metrics, we're really talking about the same columns almost in the database, which are tweaked in different ways and used for like different purposes. So we are creating sort of a CRM cube or a data mart, which will contain the most important features that help us tackle like multiple use cases. If you want to understand why a customer belongs in a certain segment and therefore what is the goal with that segment, and then use those variables to actually drive email campaigning from HubSpot, you can do that because it's all part of our CRM cube. But then if you want to know churn reporting and what actually affected churn reporting, or Why did a customer churn? What did they do before that? Yes, go to the CRM cube. You're going to find all of the key metrics associated with the customer in that particular set of data. So basically, the plumbing of the data and pipelining and how we structure that and how we define our dimensional models is very, very closely linked to what our company understands as the segmentation of our buyers and sellers and how we actually action upon it. Because if you don't have the plumbing right, you can't take any actions about it. Like you'll have a really great segmentation and then no automation on top of it. What do you do with that?
It sounds like the first 9 months has been really amazing in terms of what you've accomplished. It sounds like you have even some more lofty goals. I definitely would like to, have you back on like 6 months, a year from now, and see, once you've actually put the segmentation in place and starting to see the fruition and results of that work. I'd be really curious to see the impact that it's had on the business.
Yeah, first of all, I would love to be back. And secondly, that's really the goal. Like, basically, why are we bringing all this data together? Part of the sort of feedback loop that's missing today that we hope to close by doing all this plumbing is to basically you put your customer in the middle of the circle and then you put every single data source around that circle. Salesforce, what is the sales engagement action? Marketing, how did the customer respond to a campaign and what data are we pulling from HubSpot? The platform itself, well, what is the customer doing on it? What are they buying on it? Then LeafLink Financial, okay, are they also using LeafLink Financial? How much LeafLink Financial are they using? And then Zendesk, like how many tickets did the customer create? What was the response? How many were resolved, not resolved? You put your customer in the middle, and if you assemble all your data sources around it, then you have the ability to start doing that, linking actions to impact and then prioritizing. you know at that point you stop having product built for who is the user and marketing targeting whom do we want to target, and we align those dots basically across the company. And unless we bring that data together and look at things holistically, we won't do it.
Awesome, man. I think you're doing some awesome things there from the perspective of laying so much foundation and building on it. Thanks for being on. I mean, I think it's a big transition in terms of kind of the industries you've been in, some of the new challenges. So I appreciate you being on and kind of walking us through some of those. And I think the trade-off decisions of some of the design stuff you made hopefully will resonate with the audience and help. If somebody has a question that about something you've discussed, maybe they want to talk about the roadmap or some of the choices to kind of help someone else. Is LinkedIn the best way somebody can get in touch with you? Twitter, is there another avenue you'd prefer?
LinkedIn is great. Yeah. LinkedIn engagement has been going up, I feel, over the past few years. The threshold level for a post on LinkedIn to get likes used to be like 5 likes 4 years ago. Today, I think a LinkedIn post on an average gets like 25 likes.
Yeah, LinkedIn's become a core component. And we'll include your LinkedIn profile in the show notes so that if somebody wants to reach out to you to kind of follow up on some of what you talked about, they can do that. Again, thank you for being on. I think that you had a very good walkthrough of some of the choices you've made. Hopefully, the audience will find that useful. And we'll be back again next week with another episode. And as always, leave some feedback for us. I'm always looking for show ideas and topics you want covered. And then also, if you guys can subscribe to the podcast, that'd be awesome. We can get the reach up a little bit more that way. And until next week, we'll be back. Thank you.